All right, it should be recording. I don't know if we've introduced Vikash, but one of the best speakers around, national finalist. DX or IX again?
DX.
DX national finalist. Obviously very accomplished speaker. He's going to be talking about the art of delivery, and I'm going to be chiming in after each point. So yeah, whenever you're ready.
Sure. Thank you, Brian. So yeah, I've been doing Extemp for 3 years now, and I think, obviously when you get up towards trying to get better at Extemp in the so-called higher league, I feel like that's when you want to focus a lot on your content. But I think as a framework throughout your Extemp career, developing a good, like solid, presentable, personality through your delivery is super, super important because it'll elevate your overall performance. And I think it's something that is very, very important in Extemp today more than ever. So yeah, we're just going to go through some different techniques that you can follow and different styles of delivery that you can try to capitalize in your speeches and kind of focus on the different moods that you want to try to invoke with your audience, if that makes sense. So to start out, obviously when giving a speech in Extemp, it's sometimes we can get carried away with trying to just present information for the sake of giving information, and we often don't really invoke a certain emotion from our audience members in a final round or even the judges in preliminary rounds. So before we get into this lecture, I think it's important for us to kind of take a step back and kind of think about the emotions that we try to bring about in our own human voice. So take like 30 seconds to a minute and try to like list 5 to 7 emotions that you think encompass our human voice or our overall emotions that we try to invoke in our everyday conversations, but as well as, in speech rounds as well. And I'll do this with you. Okay, hopefully you guys got a few, emotions listed out. If anyone would like to share what they brainstormed, they're more than welcome to, turn on their mic and share. You don't have to share the whole list. It can just be one emotion.
I guess an obvious one might be happiness.
Of course, right? When you're trying, I think a lot of times some extempers, they forget to smile. And I know when I've seen Brian, for example, give a speech before, I know that one thing I remember is that he was very personable because he was always making sure to smile in and out of his speech to kind of connect with the judges when he needed to. And I think a lot of times, we can get carried away with just bringing out really sad information that we don't forget to connect with them. So yeah, of course, convoking happiness or just showing that you genuinely are like a human at the end of the day is really important. Surprise, shock, right? Trying to, yeah, that one statistic you find about like an important event that you found interesting during prep is probably something that they haven't even heard of either. Yeah, trying to bring that into your speeches is really important, of course.
Fear.
Yep. Yeah, when we're talking a lot about like foreign policy, for example, I think a lot of times it can get overwhelming for the judges if they see an imminent threat that we, haven't really covered in the news, but we see against the United States or in a foreign situation, which we should probably try to, show a genuine concern to the judges as well. Yeah, of course. There's another big one. Sadness, exactly. That's what I was looking for. Yeah, sadness, right? Because I think a lot of times you want to be able to bring out your inner pathos or your overall like emotional component of your speech. And I think that's really important because it sets you out in the round, because obviously you don't want it to be like, super dramatic and over the top, but obviously like bringing in the fact that you genuinely care about a problem and it's not being changed or it's continuing to get worse, right? And showing that in your human voice with your judge can help them remember it more at the end of the route, for sure. So yeah, now that we've kind of talked about the different, emotions that we see within our human voice, we'll go through the 7 so-called phases of extemp, right? They're different vocal inflections or different strategies that you can, with your tone, that you can utilize to better your overall speech. So starting out, the first voice that we're going to cover is, your upset sort of tone when you're giving a speech. So typically when you're talking about, this usually goes along with like humanitarian crises or a war of some sort, of conflict. And obviously when you explain these types of incidences, you want to kind of change the way your overall facial reactions go with the information that you're presenting. So typically you kind of want to slow down your speech, right? You want to emphasize more of what you're saying. Obviously you want to act more sympathetic to your judge, explain something that's really, kind of sad, and kind of explain that to the judge. An example that I used in the previous lecture is there's always this, whenever I talk about the opioid crisis or a speech that's related to that, there's this article that I try to cite from The Atlantic from 2018, I believe. It kind of points out that in the year 2018, there were more people that died from an opioid overdose than the entirety of the Vietnam War, right? So this is surprising, obviously, for starters, but more importantly, it's really sad, right? The fact that this problem continues to persist and so many lives are, lost in this process. So I try to, when I try to invoke this point, when I cite this to my judges, I try to, act more, not even act, this is very, realistic, right? Make sure your facial reactions are very, concerned, and also slow down and kind of explain the fact that, the problem continues to persist today. And as a result, we can turn to a different article and kind of link that with your, your main point. I think this is especially important when providing background information to speeches in which judges don't really know a lot about the crisis, kind of explaining here's the problem, and then explain that in your upset tone, if that makes sense, and then lead them into the information that you're going to provide in your substructure. Brian, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to say that this is also probably more niche. This upset kind of tone is obviously not correct for every single speech, because while there are probably bad things happening everywhere, right? There are probably bad things happening everywhere. There are different degrees of how upset you need to be about them. And this is really about being disappointed. So I think it's really useful, but I would say that I don't use this that often.
Yeah, I think obviously it varies from speaker to speaker. I think this year for me, I kind of use this a little more than I would have wanted to. I double entered this year in oratory, and a lot of oratory things that we kind of focus on are very pathos oriented. And I noticed that my speech kind of and even in extent kind of changed a little bit more to this, sadder part, if that makes sense. So obviously work with what you can, kind of perfect your overall presence with the judge, but obviously don't overdo it and do what makes sense in the moment, obviously. So yeah, that's the first tone. And obviously, if you guys have any questions, go ahead and, turn on your mic, ask questions, or raise your hand if that on Zoom. I don't really know how that works, but yeah. Okay, we can move to the next one. Okay, so the second voice is sadness. We kind of talked about this in the beginning, right? So this is something that, again, I kind of utilize more, but obviously not every speaker's going to have this type of a vocal inflection throughout their extemp careers. But this is when you want to slow down, obviously, just like the previous tone. But I think you kind of want the judge to kind of, the information to sink in, if that makes sense. So what I try to do is try to add more pauses in this voice, right? So when you present a really important statistic or something that's really sad, that's going around the world, or even within our own nation, whether it be political or based on our economic situation right now, present that fact, right? But then slow down while you're presenting it, and then the moment you finish, the line or the sentence that's kind of presenting the impact, just pause for maybe 2 to 3 seconds before you connect to the next point. that simple pause can help the judge kind of like catch up to what you just said in that last sentence and even write it down in their flow, right? So when they're going back at the end of the speech and they're like looking to, end of the round rather, and they're looking at all the speakers that presented and they remember this one thing that kind of like resonated with them, that's going to add more of like your overall persona and add to your overall, presentation that a lot of other speakers might not, capitalize on. So typically you want to use this when you have a sad impact, like, warfare, death, poverty, again, like talked about with humanitarian crises. And I think there's a lot of components that you can use in a lot of speeches that we kind of give today, because there's always some flaw to the topic that you're arguing or presenting to your judges. And if there's something, an anecdote that you can provide that explains, a certain situation with someone that is, being affected by the Me Too movement, for example, or different components in which you can provide personal stories, this is the voice that you want to try to use the most, because I think that's when you can really be more remembered in the round and provide a better impact, especially when you get to like in more advanced rounds, whether it be finals or whatever, in a round where people, you obviously don't want to change the shift too much, because there are going to be people that give speeches that are a bit more optimistic, but if you can try to be a little bit more real and provide that raw, emotion to a certain speech, that'll help you set the stage a little bit more compared to your competitors. So that's my take on this voice.
Yeah, just to emphasize one thing that Vikash said, the pause thing is super important, I think, not only in the sadness, but overall, but this super, super important for this voice in particular, because as soon as you pause deliberately, it forces them to like reckon with what you just said, right? So I think pausing, super, super effective, and it's something that every extemper needs to be doing.
For sure.
I have a quick question. So like, let's say that the speech is about something that's just totally sad in general, like warfare or children dying. Like, obviously this is a good voice as well as upset. But like, how do you make sure it's not too much so that the judge doesn't just end up getting depressed by the end?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think it's something that a lot of extempers kind of have to deal with, because, you want to bring a mix of emotions. I think the best part that you can kind of differentiate from your like sadness, if that makes sense, is, for me personally, I try to do this in my transitions. So what I try to do is, if I have like an opening vehicle, or I have like, some sort of like a fact or statistics that I want to kind of incorporate within my transitions leading up to my points, what I try to do is, even if it's like a super, super like, something that has to do with war or whatever, if it's something with foreign policy, for example, if I can try to intertwine like a bash at some, dumb foreign policy move, or something that's kind of like ironic in a way, I try to do that in my transition into the point. Then I provide the background information, and then I get towards the serious part. So even that like 5 to 10 seconds of like some amusement or humor within the judge won't disrupt your overall persona within the round. Obviously, you don't want to be insensitive, right? You don't want to be talking about like some really sad statistic and then all of a sudden add a joke, because that'll just seem out of place. But if you can try to like intertwine something that's amusing or ironic right as you set the stage for each one of your points, you can have a mix of emotions within your speech that is balanced and flavorful for your judges. So I think that's something that you could try, obviously, if you want to try to vary your overall emotion within that speech. I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
All right, let's go to the next one. All right, the third vocal inflection or voice, right, is being informative. So this is something that, I think is probably one of the easier ones, right? Because whenever you're writing your flow with your sources and stuff, your flow is basically, for the most part, just raw information. So when you're applying this into your speech and giving your informative parts of your speech, it can be really easy to stay completely monotone, as it says in the slide, but I would try to focus on having slight vocal inflections to kind of like change the overall arc of your message, if that makes sense. So, when you're providing that background information is especially crucial during introduction of each point. That's when you can be super, super informative, right? Kind of lay the framework for, why this step is crucial for combating ... right? So this is super important then as well. I think when you're citing articles, especially, that's when things start to get a lot more informative and that right in the meat of your point, as it says. That's when a lot of judges can kind of zone out, if that makes sense. So try to vary your vocal inflections, like maybe raise your voice a little bit, but then also lower your voice, but not, in a chaotic manner to where they're kind of just lost, but in a way that like really emphasizes your point. If you have a lot of statistics in your point, which I don't strongly recommend, I think having a few like statistics are important, right? Because it differentiates yourself. But if you're filled with like 5 statistics in your first point, the judge isn't really going to pick up on the different variations. I think it's important for you to kind of like pick and choose which ones are the most important. So when you get to that point, really emphasizing that, slowing down on that number, 36 million blank, whatever, right? Or when we're talking about like the housing crisis, there's an article that I remember citing in a previous round where it talked about how, for an average worker working at minimum wage, a 2-bedroom household is not, affordable in any state within the United States. So like working 40 hours a week and having a minimum wage is not enough for them to even sustain a proper rent for a 2-bedroom household in many counties across the United States. When I explained that like number 0 counties, like emphasizing that point to a greater regard can really help resonate with the judge. And I think that's something that you want to try to do more with your informative voice, not staying super, level, but try to incorporate different styles, if that makes sense. Yeah, this is a very straightforward point. Okay, we can move to the next one if no one has any questions. All right. Okay, so this one is hopeful voice, or trying to just be more optimistic, I guess, right? So for this one, okay, so this is an important, you have to try to provide an important contrast when you have this type of a voice. I think, having that slight smile and kind of like opening yourself up to your judge or your audience is super important. I think throughout this lecture, what the number one takeaway I would say is like really, I think on Zoom, it's a little different, right? I think looking at your camera is kind of your way of giving eye contact to your judge. Try to like centralize your focus on there, because even though you're on a virtual background, if you can seem like you're looking straight at them, that'll be like, all the more powerful and all the more helpful for you in the long term. But I think in real life, right, having great eye contact throughout the speech, even when they're writing stuff down, it'll really elevate your overall, connection with the judge. And I think while you're doing that, when you're trying to be more optimistic and like more hopeful, I think it works more of the time when they're actually looking at you, right? But like if you kind of add in like slight, refreshing anecdotes or statistics or facts within your speech, that can help like kind of carry your overall, emotion cycle within your speech as well. I think like it says right here, a lot of speeches really go down a very dark path, if that makes sense, right? When you're kind of talking about a topic that's just really just sad as a whole, it can be really concerning sometimes. But if you have like a question that's like, what steps can be taken, or what are some plausible, ways that we can help reduce the overall, rate of ... right? Those types of questions. If you have a solution that you're trying to bring forth, you can provide this type of a, if the United Nations or if this country implements this strategy, these number of lives could be saved within the first year, or by implementing or, having an infrastructure plan, we could provide for more than, I'm just throwing out a number, 35,000 jobs within the first year alone, right? That kind of a hopeful voice can be really, really helpful at trying to like provide the reasons for why, your solution really stands out in a number basis. And I think having that smile and open attitude can really emphasize your overall performance. Brian, do you have anything to add to that?
Not really. I think, yeah, for this point, covered it pretty well.
And again, if anyone has any questions or comments, you're welcome to speak. Okay, we'll go to the next one. All right. Excitement. Okay. So this can be a little hard for a lot of us, I think. Obviously, we don't want to seem cliche when we're trying to say something that's super exciting, right? But I think these types of vocal inflections are super important and stuff that people find intriguing as a whole. think about all those science and technology rounds that you've probably had in the past. Like talking about like 5G technology sometimes can be overwhelming with like China's domination, I guess. But like if you're talking about 5G technology as a whole and kind of emphasizing like the difference between our current systems, this is when you can really start to like bring about those statistics with like an excited revolutionary tone. This can be the same for AI, or you can talk about like this can also apply to a lot of political speeches too, right? If you're talking about new peace deals or new changes that are being made within an established, form of government, or radical, organizations that are trying to take over a more dictatorial nation, or even when you're talking about past instances, this is when you can really explain like why you're excited about it. And I think the more that you do with your reactions to your own speech, the more that the judges are going to follow, right? When you smile at your own anecdote or joke, or when you act more excited for your own like important figures, the judges kind of resonate with that energy. So even if they don't completely like think of it on their own, by watching you, they kind of replicate it, is what I've kind of noticed throughout, giving a lot of speeches to judges. And I think that's something that you can really try to do throughout any of your speeches. But if you have that like one or two factual points that you want to kind of explain to your judges, this is when you can really capitalize on that. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily recognize that it's such a powerful tool that you can use for a variety of extemp speeches. Yeah. So higher pitch, open smile, look like you actually want to be there, if that makes sense, right? Because a lot of times people walk in and into the rounds and they look really depressed, and then they start their speech and then it just stays depressed, and then they leave and they have no impact. But changing it up, that really, really changes the way that you present things. And for me personally, right, I wouldn't consider myself like a delivery focused judge, but a lot of judges out there are delivery focused judges and they don't even realize it, right? Especially in Extemp, where they're a coach for drama or duo or humor, right? And they're walking into an Extemp speech round and they're like, okay, I don't really like this category anyway. It's just a bunch of informative speeches that I don't really know a lot about. But if you can educate your judge about something that they didn't even know, or they learned something from it, that takeaway is probably one of the best things you can do in an Extemp round. And I think utilizing this voice can be very, very beneficial in the long term. Does anyone have any questions? All right. Yeah, most of this is self-explanatory. So, okay. The next one. Okay, so this is when acting persuasive, or presenting that smarter kind of nuance to your speech. Okay, so I think we'll start with the persuasive part. I think a lot of times we kind of forget that, although we aren't technically debating against someone, I think this is where I try to bring in my like inner debater, if that makes sense. Because at the end of the day, a lot of your Extemp speeches are kind of like, in a way, right, your own rebuttal. Because you're trying to persuade your judge about a topic and why like your points or your plan of action or your analysis for a certain topic is factual and the most reasonable, right, in the 3-point structure that you're given. So I think this is when you try to emulate like a politician that you see on stage, for example. Maybe not Joe Biden, because he's not the best at being eloquent, but I think trying to personalize your overall persuasion within your own speech as a solid speaker is really important. I really like listening to like speeches from Obama. I think a lot of times like the way that he kind of carries himself through speeches and like acting as he is a politician, but speaking like a politician is super, super persuasive to a lot of people. Some people find it cliche, right? Like the tones that he uses sometimes. But for the most part, a lot of people like the way that he speaks. So I think trying to stay engaging and like persuading the judges with your hand gestures and your overall like facial reactions can really change the way that you kind of do Extemp as a whole. As for being more smart within your rounds, this is where your word economy really like can kind of elevate your experience. There are a lot of people that, try to incorporate very basic, language that you would kind of use in your day-to-day conversations, which isn't bad at all, right? But I think sometimes by adding a few more like, I don't know, sophisticated words that make sense and are obviously not too complicated for the judges to understand, can help you seem more professional. And this sounds kind of weird, right? But judges kind of pick up on that when they hear a word that they just you wouldn't see in the conventional vocabulary among average Americans. It adds to your overall, scope of your persuasion. And I think that's super, super important especially when you go into more out rounds, especially because judges at the end of the day, like regardless of how your speech goes, when they're pushing you towards, like, for example, if you're in a semi round, they want to make sure that when you go into finals, you seem like a person who is really someone that can kind of like showcase a strong message, but also kind of can persuade like other speakers that are watching to kind of emulate certain characteristics. And I think obviously you don't want to just blindly copy other people that you see. It's really important to have your own personal kind of speaking style, but I think being able to persuade the judge in that like more sophisticated manner is something that will take you a long way if you start to try to apply different techniques in the beginning of itself. So yeah.
I think in particular, this sort of voice is very good to use in like your B and C subpoints, like your solution subpoints, your change subpoints, and your impact subpoints, because that's where you're really making the crux of your logical argument and your persuasive argument, especially in the impact, where you need to tie it back to why this matters for the world and how everything connects together. You really want to sound persuasive, smart, and like you know what you're talking about.
Yeah, totally. I mean, adding on to what you were saying, I think a lot of times, like even I'm guilty of this, where we give a speech and we present information, but we don't exactly link it to why it's going to work or how it's going to work or why it matters, right? And I think that's super, super important where you want to kind of elevate your persuasive tone, because if the judge doesn't understand why the fact that you're bringing up a plan is linked to a plausible solution in your speech, then that kind of like breaks apart with your content judges, especially because they're looking for reasons why the information you're presenting is linked to your point. And if it's not linked in a persuasive manner, that's when you can lose out on those judges. And I think that's something that you should always try to improve. For sure.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, how is this voice, like persuasive voice, different in usage from number 3, the informative voice? Because shouldn't you like always be a little bit persuasive?
Of course. Yeah, this is a good disclaimer to kind of throw out here. So these 7 voices that we're giving to you, they're not necessarily like, I use only one at a certain time and then I move on to the next one or I move on to, it's not like that. I think a lot of times you want to incorporate a multitude of these voices within your speeches. So obviously staying informed and presenting an informative, like point, as well as having solid persuasion within your like substructure of your speeches are going to elevate you even more. And I think incorporating a multitude of these voices within each of your points as a whole will make it a lot better, right? You don't want to only have a speech that's completely in an excited tone or a hopeful tone. It's about mixing them at the right and most like efficient way possible, if that makes sense. So yeah. Okay, and then our last voice. Okay, so this is your kind of ironic / ridicule voice, right? Okay, so I try to do this for me personally. This usually happens in the AGDs. I think if there's something, okay, so this is something that I recommended in the last lecture. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard of The Onion, right? Can you guys give like a thumbs up or like a yes? Do I need to explain it to anyone? I guess a quick explanation. The Onion is like a satirical website that has a lot of like kind of misleading article titles that are kind of ironic to like, see, because it's just really surprising that this even exists. But a lot of the time it's fake, right? It's not real. However, what I try to go to is a Reddit page called Not the Onion. You can maybe write it down if you wanted to. Not the Onion. So this Reddit page has a lot of articles that are actually real, right? But they sound super ironic or surprising. And so if you can like, they post a lot of like almost every day and there's always a lot of articles. And if you can like kind of scope through that at like the beginning of your turn or whatever, and try to find like some articles that are similar to the topic areas in that like tournament, there are some great AGDs that you could find about like different politicians and different important topics that you can bring up in your intro and kind of cite and kind of emphasize your overall speech. My final round this year on online ads was a bit interesting because I I should have spent more time on my transitions and intro, but I was focused more on my like overall like points. But by the time I got to it, my question was about mainstream media and about like what they should do to improve in the future. And my intro, I kind of talked about like, I brought in this intro about how China is deleted its popular WeChat account because it was able to like convince a lot of its viewers that the United States was using dead bodies from COVID-19 to make hamburgers. And so this was like extremely surprising, ironic, and like the judges were very shocked. And I kind of linked that to the fact that, you know, kind of the fact that more people are starting to utilize these types of platforms and actually believe it is surprising, but it also shows to the fact that we're moving away from getting information from mainstream media. And like as simple as that link may be, the fact that I found that article or like that surprising fact, the fact it can be used for a lot of different speeches regarding misinformation or, you know, political endeavors, right? But finding these types of important AGDs or surprising facts are really a very, very good first impression for your judges. Yeah. All right, move to the end here. So yeah, I don't think we'll have time here to practice right now, but maybe when you're, you know, obviously practicing for your speeches or flowing and prepping for your speeches that you'll have later this week, try to kind of, you know, these different strategies, and maybe even if you don't have to write it in your flow, try to be more mindful the next time you give a speech, right? What can I do to really change the way that I present? Because I know I heard Anant say something similar to this, but you're just as good as you kind of present your information as you actually have your information for your speech. So the way that you can actually present it is more important to a lot of judges in the long term than your actual, you know, information, which may seem misleading at times, but when we think about it, a lot of judges, they don't hear every single argument that you make. But when you sound more convincing, that makes all the difference. And I think working on these drills, maybe recording yourself giving certain speeches, and recording yourself giving different, you know, not the onion intros or AGDs or different parts of your speech can really help you see what you do and how you can change in the future. So yeah, with that, if anyone has any questions, they're more than welcome to ask. But hopefully you gained something out of this. I'm sure a lot of it was very straightforward, but I think it'll help you kind of gain perspective on whether or not you actually do this in your speeches. Because it can be easy to kind of know about this, but not really in your overall execution or implementation. So yeah.
Okay, cool. If nobody has any questions, I just want to thank Vikash once again. Everyone should probably give him like a Zoom clap or something. Very informative, very helpful presentation. This is going to be recorded, uploaded. And once again, thank you. One of the best extempers on the circuit right now. We are going to right now, it's 11 a.m., go back into the main room, or like, I don't know if Steve has already assigned you to like a second breakout room. I'm not sure how that works, but we can definitely go back to the main room right now, and then I guess work it out from there. Cool. And I'll just end the recording now.
Thank you. This was a great lecture.
Yeah. No